So the next section is called not holding on to the head. And the idea here is that people have chased after the wrong thing in many cases. And he says specifically these teachers who are teaching the Colossians this stuff have started chasing after the wrong thing. They're not chasing after the Messiah anymore. They're not holding on to the head. They are chasing after shadows, is one verse that he uses. So this is the first time he actually gets into detail about what these teachers have been talking, but still there's not a whole lot of detail. And so it's kind of likely that there are more than one teacher, or there is more than one teacher who is teaching different things. And he doesn't want to try and waste his time talking about each and every thing, because the principle he's teaching is a much bigger thing. The principle is you have everything you need in the Messiah. You don't need anything more. Don't go chasing after these teachers. And so Colossians 2:16 and 17 says, "Let no man disturb you about food or about drink or in the distinctions of feast and beginnings of months and Sabbaths, because these things are shadows of those things that were future, but the Messiah is the body." So as we said, some people use this verse to say that all these things are canceled. The Sabbath is canceled, all of these observances are canceled, everything.
Yeah, even the pork and all that.
Yeah,
That.
Food and drink. Yeah, yeah. They use that to say that this is the verse that tells us clearly that everything is canceled. But that's not what the verse is saying. So, as I said before, Paul doesn't really explain this teaching in a lot of detail because he's trying to do a much higher description of what you need to do as a Christian, how you need to live and think. And so one thing you can see in here, though, is he says, don't let any person disturb you about drink. Now, in Judaism, there is no restriction on drink. You can drink whatever you want. There isn't an unclean drink like there is unclean foods. And so this is plainly not Judaism. This is something else that people are teaching. And so Judaism had no restrictions there. So this is something that isn't Judaism, but it's kind of an extension of the law as far as we can tell. And so our guess is that there are people who are teaching Christians, then they're teaching things that are required in addition to what God had said you needed to do. And so they were restricting people in food and drink in ways that the Bible didn't say or God didn't say. And so we're kind of left a little bit to guess at exactly what these people were saying, but we get some hints from what Paul is saying. So these feasts and Sabbath observances hinted about future things. That's what he says with shadows. He says all of these things were shadows of things that were the future, but the Messiah is the body. And so what he's saying is that if these people who are getting you to focus on the shadow things by extending food and drink laws and extending different things, changing things, he said these people are chasing after the shadows and they're not chasing after the body, which is the Messiah. And so that's the important thing for us as well, is that we need to not be dragged away and have our focus taken to other things, but to always have our focus on Him and only Him.
Well, there was we did a study one time in one of the colleges that I attended at Wayland Baptist University, and they were saying that the Jews, just like a lot of other people, they will look at a Bible verse or a commandment or whatever, and they'll make it become whatever they want it to be. For example, they didn't believe in working on the Sabbath, which is fine. However, they define work as, very differently. They would say, if I walk 1 mile, then it's not really work because I'm getting a little exercise. However, if I'm walking to go home, it's okay. So what they were doing is they would have somebody that works for them or knows them and to put a little bit of food for them at a post someplace a mile away. So every mile they would have something to eat, and they would say, I'm going home because this is where I eat. On and on and on. There's nothing in the Bible about that.
No.
But see, that's the way people are.
Yeah, that's trying to skirt around the rules.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, some people will do that sort of thing, trying to find ways around it. We need to be submitted to God, and it's not an easy thing to do. Okay, so Colossians 2:18 says, neither let a man be pleased by humility of mind to subjugate you to the worship of angels to your condemnation, by which he presumes upon something that he does not see and is emptily puffed up in his carnal mind. So this is that we talked about the first teacher and what he was teaching about restrictions on food and drink and Sabbath and other things that weren't restrictions in the Bible. They were restrictions that these people were making up. And so this second teacher now is talking about something different. He's talking about angels and the worship of angels. And again, it's still not entirely clear. The person may be saying that if you are really humble, then you would understand that you are less than angels, and therefore you would worship angels as you worship God. And Paul is saying here clearly the worship of angels would be your condemnation. Don't do that. And so again, this idea of worshiping angels doesn't seem to be anything that comes from Judaism. Judaism really didn't make that much out of angels and still doesn't. So it's not clear where this is coming from. Some people just made it up for their own reasons, I guess. Paul says the teacher wants to use your humility to enslave you, to subjugate you. He wants you to be humble, but he's trying to make humble into something different. And he says, yet the teacher himself has no humility. He calls the teacher puffed up and carnal. And so he's saying this man who's puffed up with himself and has a carnal nature is trying to enslave you by using your humility against you. And he says this teacher teaches about things he doesn't see. He doesn't know anything about this stuff, about angels. He's never seen an angel and knows nothing of how angels are, and yet he's teaching people they should worship angels. And he says also that this teacher makes a presumption. He's presumptuous, which means the same thing as audacious, stepping beyond the limit of reason and of making sense. And so he talks about this teacher or teachers, if there's more than one of them. And he says that be careful, this is what he wants to do. He wants you to be enslaved to him, to do his teaching. So the teacher really is getting his thrill. And the verse says, neither let a man be pleased. So he says, don't please this man by doing what he says. He just wants to get his thrill from having disciples and people who follow around and do things that he tells them to do. So he's really in it for himself. So those are the two teachers he talks about here. He says a bit more about the second teacher. He continues on here and he says, and this person is not holding the head, from whom the whole body is constructed and settled in the joints and members and grows with the growth of God. So again, here he's talking about this. With the first teacher, he said, this person is chasing after shadows instead of holding on to the body. And now he says this person is not holding on to the head, from whom everything is built. Instead, he's teaching you on other things that are not the things of God. So if this person is a he, we don't know who the teacher is, but this person is not holding on to the head, he says, and he's lost his focus on Jesus, who is the head of the church. And again, we come up with this idea that these false teachings pull you away and put your focus on something else, taking it off of Jesus where your focus should be. So, so Paul here views the church as a human body, and he does that in many other places too. That's a common practice of his, is to describe the church as a body with hands and arms and legs and feet and things like that. And he does that again here when he talks about joints and members of the whole body. And so he's saying you can live without a hand or a leg. It's all about the head. That's the thing that's important. And Jesus is the head, and from that body grows arms and feet and joints and all the other things as God wills. So he talks about the church beginning as the head, which is Jesus, and growing from that, bodies, arms, and all the rest of it, which is an interesting way to look at it. We don't think of a body as growing from the head, but he says in the church that's the way it works. The body begins with the head and grows outward. So these teachers, we might ask, who are these teachers? And we get a little bit of a hint from something that is said in here by Paul. He says both teachers have lost their focus on Jesus, who is the head. They're focusing on other things. And so when he talks about they've lost their focus on Jesus, that would only make sense if he was talking about Christians. If he was talking about Jews, of course a Jew doesn't have his focus on Jesus. He doesn't believe Jesus either existed or was who he said he was. Instead, they believe that Jesus was just some guy who was killed on a cross. And so he's probably not talking about Jews. If the teachers were Jews, you wouldn't expect them to have their focus on Jesus, so you wouldn't say that. So likely the teachers were people who claimed to be Christians, but were teaching things that weren't Christian. They were teaching new restrictions on feasts and Sabbaths and teaching angel worship. And that's a problem that you always see in the churches, is people within the church teaching things that aren't from God. And that's just, we've seen that so many times in our own lives. We know that story by heart. So now going on to verses 20 through 22, we're close to the end here. And in these verses, he's going to say, "For if you had died with the Messiah to the principles of the world, why are you just as if you live in the world? Namely, do not touch, do not taste, do not hold, which are the things that need to be destroyed, and are the commandments and the teachings of the sons of men." So here's this reference again to teachings of sons of men. He says these things aren't Bible teachings. These are men are making up these teachings, and they aren't for you. You shouldn't be chasing after them. And so Paul at the beginning of this chapter was talking about principles of the world. And here again we see that mentioned. So these principles of the world are teachings of men that they're trying to bring into the church. And they are people who claim to be Christians in the church. And so that makes it difficult for people to understand, because you think this person is a Christian, but he's teaching things that make some sense. And Paul is actually going to go ahead and say that sometimes these things sound like they make sense. But they don't. They're teachings that must be destroyed, is what Paul says here. That you need to get rid of that. And so these people have been teaching restrictions, saying you don't touch this, don't taste this, don't hold on to this. And so they've been adding restrictions that aren't biblical restrictions. They're adding restrictions that they've thought up themselves. And he says, if you died to the world, why do you look like you live in the world? And that is also a problem with all of Christians. There are lots of people who claim to be Christians, but don't live like that. They don't look like that. They don't behave like that. And that's kind of a sad statement, but a lot of the church is like that. And so this is kind of an epiphany moment. You might never have thought of it this way, or the Colossae church might not have ever thought of it this way, that if you are following these teachings that are being taught by a Christian in your church, you're actually chasing after the things of the world. And so that kind of might have clued in, oh yeah, this guy really isn't teaching the things that we should be following. He's teaching things that he's made up himself. Okay, so verse 23 then. And this is again the idea, which is really the focus of this whole chapter. Things that sound good, but they really aren't good. They aren't godly. And so from Colossians 2:23, he says, "And they appear to have in them a word of wisdom, in the appearance of humility and worship of God, and without sparing the body, not in things of honor, but in those things which are physical needs." And so breaking this down, these verses that Paul writes are all very long verses with multiple clauses, and they're difficult to read. So I break them down for you. And what he's saying here is these teachers, the things that they teach, they appeal to us because the words seem wise. They appear to be based on humility. Remember, he said that one teacher was using your humility to entrap you. And so humility, which is a Christian characteristic that we all should have. We should be humble people. But these people are trying to use that humility for their own advantage. But he says what these teachers teach seem to be based on humility, which seems like a good thing. So it sounds good, but what they're doing with it is wrong. And he says these people also appear to be teaching worship of God in what they're teaching. But again, it's not worship of God, it's worship of other things. And in fact, worship of the teachers is what many of them are looking for. And he says another thing that's being taught by these people that seem to be wise is that they seek to constrain the body in the sense of fasting or sacrificing. So in a food fast, what you're doing is you're constraining the body. You don't eat food for a period of time. And that's what he's talking about here, is that fasting is a good thing. It's a Christian thing for us to do, but he says these people are teaching you different things about it. But it sounds like fasting that they're teaching, but they're actually teaching something that isn't fasting. And so that's really the problem here, is that all of these things have a basis that looks like it's based on the Messiah and on the Bible, but it isn't based on the Bible. And he says, but these things are not honorable to God. It only deprives one of physical necessities. So what he's saying is, if you follow all these rules that limit you in all sorts of ways, you're not honoring God at all. You're just honoring the person who told you to do these things. And instead of that, you're just depriving yourself of physical necessities like food and drink, but not achieving anything with God. Does that make some sense that way? Paul teaches some very big ideas sometimes. Okay, summarizing the whole chapter. He says, I want you to be comforted so that you may grow in the wealth of understanding and wisdom that is hidden in the Messiah. But he said, but don't be deceived by persuasive words. And these persuasive words are coming to the Colossae church and discomforting them, because people are teaching them things that they haven't heard before, but they're saying that these are godly things that they need to do. And so their comfort has been taken away from them by these teachers. And Paul wants them to be comforted so they can continue to grow. And so he says, continue to walk in the way of Jesus. And that's really his central point here, is don't go chasing after these things that these teachers are teaching. Just continue to walk in the way that I taught you to walk. Do those sort of things. And in that way, you will strengthen your roots and you'll grow your trunk and become established. And he's using a tree as a metaphor there of a tree growing. And he says, be watchful that no one robs you of your wealth, using high-sounding empty words. And that's what these teachers are doing. They're teaching things that sound good. They sound godly. They sound like they have value in them. But they don't have anything in them. They're empty words that have no value. And Paul continues on after that, warning of don't be robbed by these people. He says that everything that you need is in the Messiah, and absolutely everything that is of any value to you as a Christian is in the Messiah. And if you have the Messiah, then you have everything you need. And why would you think of needing anything more? Why would you listen to somebody who is telling you to do something else? And in our modern times, we might say people telling you that you should keep Christmas, or you should do Easter. Easter's the holiest day of the year, I've been told. And so these people do the same thing. They teach things that sound godly. And Christmas is all about the birth of Jesus. That sounds good. And so in our time, we have similar things, but not exactly the same thing. But he's making the same point. Why would you need anything more? Why would you go chasing after these things that aren't from the Messiah? They aren't from the Bible. They aren't from God. And then continuing on, we saw that one teacher is teaching these new man-made rules for observances. He's limiting the things that were observances that we should do even further, and saying that you shouldn't do them in particular ways and times. We don't know the details of exactly what he was teaching there. But he had made up his own restrictions on observances and had added them and was teaching them as things that Christians should do. And the other teacher that Paul talks about is teaching worship of angels. And I think that we all understand that one as being wrong. But I have seen Christians who have kind of got distracted with angels and chased off with angels. If you know who Roma Downey is, she seems to be a person like that who's really hooked into angels. And the TV shows that she has made often involve angels because of that. And so you can be dragged off by these things that sound like they're godly, but in fact they aren't godly things at all. And so Paul's point there is that neither of them are focused on the Messiah. Their focus has been turned off to other things. They're not focused on him anymore. And he says these teachings are the teachings of men, and they must be destroyed. Don't follow them. Don't consider them. Don't even think about them.